Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to start talking about community ecology. And what that really means is talking about interactions between different species. So when we talk about ecology, right, it is the interactions between species and their environment. But for this section, we're going to drill into specifically the interactions between those different species. So when we talk about community, remember it's all the different species that can live in a particular ecosystem. And so when we look at those community interactions, it really comes down to three major types: the competition, predation, and then symbiosis. So if we're going to talk competition, competition occurs when two organisms are fighting for the same limited resource. And this can be food, this can be shelter, it can be mates, it can be a number of things. And truly, competition can actually occur either interspecifically or intraspecifically. So when I'm talking about interspecific competition, this really truly is a community interaction because I'm getting two different species competing for the same limited resource, whether it's space or food of some sort. Intra-specific competition is at the population level because now I'm looking at two individuals of the same species that are competing for a limited resource. And there's a situation where I can not only include maybe food, shelter, space, but also the mates. Because remember, when we talk about mating behavior, that mating is going to occur only between individuals of the same species. So it could be a example of intraspecific, but not interspecific, because two individuals, I should say, of different species, aren't going to compete over a mate because they are different species and don't mate across that species line. So hopefully that makes sense. When we talk about competition, this is going to come at a cost to all individuals involved. Each organism has less access to the resources and thus are both harmed by that competition. Either one's going to win the resource or not, but they are both expending energy and time and potential harm, literally physically harm, in the actual competition behavior. So, because species have to share these habitats, they have to share these resources, there's only a finite amount, right? And so that is why competition occurs, because there aren't unlimited resources. Um, think about a bunch of kindergarten students in a classroom with two Oreos, right? Somebody's winning that Oreo and somebody's not. You've got a finite amount of Oreos in the classroom, that's the limiting resource, and there are way more individuals in that classroom that can actually have access to a whole cookie. So competitive exclusion is a principle in ecology that just discusses, illustrates how species compete for resources and as a result keeps two species from occupying the same niche. So remember when we talk about a niche, right? It includes all the factors that a species needs to survive, to stay healthy, to reproduce. It is really driven by how organisms interact with each other. Who's the predator? Who's the prey? Are they a parasite? Are they the host of that parasite? And so it really gets driven down to their job. What do they do? What's their behavior when they interact with other species or other individuals of their own species within that particular community? So competitive exclusion is simply saying that I can't have two different species occupying that same job or that same role, identical role. So let me sort of illustrate what this means. So it keeps those two species from occupying the same niche, and as a result, we end up with these two outcomes, this idea of niche partitioning, and ultimately that's going to end up driving an evolutionary response. So when we talk about niche partitioning, this is where a species naturally divides those different resources based on competitive advantage. And as a result, they only use part of their full niche, meaning that a particular species of bird, in this case, who is living in this spruce tree, might be capable of living at all of these different zones in that tree, different feeding heights in that tree. But because the other species exist in that tree along with it, they end up getting this partitioning of places where that particular species is best able to utilize the resources and outcompete the others. So if I were to take this bay-breasted warbler, for example, if he was the only one in this particular spruce tree, that warbler may be able to have the ability to live and feed at all of these different heights in the tree, what we would talk about as its fundamental niche, meaning it's capable of living there. But I start throwing in competitive species, this yellow-rumped warbler, this Cape May warbler, and now that bay-breasted warbler gets limited to the middle of the tree. That's its realized niche. So fundamentally, it could exist in this whole tree, but because these other species exist here with them, this is the only part of that tree where they are best suited and can actually outcompete the Cape May and the yellow-rumped warblers, and so they are stuck here in this middle of the tree. And that's really where it comes down to this idea of evolutionary response. So these guys may have all been a similar species, the same species, at one point in their evolutionary history. Perhaps why we consider them all warblers, right? But over their evolutionary history, they started becoming more adept at competing in a certain part of that tree. And over enough period of time, not only did that geographic isolation of being stuck here most successful in the middle of the tree, then lead to reproductive isolation, where these guys would no longer reproduce with the guys at the top of the tree or these guys at the bottom of the tree. And so they eventually drifted to a point where that reproductive isolation became so pronounced that they now no longer reproduce with each other at all. And we start looking at these guys as different species. This is another classic example of this, and these are the barnacles. So when we look at these two barnacle species, these guys could potentially live in this entire intertidal zone, right? What we would think of as their fundamental niche. They can be successful there in the absence of competition. But when a different species moves in, these guys happen to be much more adept at living at this middle intertidal zone. These guys can't handle it, but they do okay up here. So these guys wouldn't be particularly successful at that upper intertidal zone. These guys, although they can live in that middle intertidal zone, get outcompeted for the resources down here, but they are capable of living here, and so they get limited to this top end. Another example, so we look at different Paramecia species. They can exist through the entire test tube, and there really are two options. Either we get complete competitive exclusion, where these guys just completely outcompete the second species, and so that second species goes extinct, or we get the resource partitioning, where these guys are capable of surviving at the top of the test tube, maybe a little more oxygen-rich environment, and they can handle it, where these guys do much better in a lower oxygen environment, and so they end up being much more successful at the bottom of the test tube, and so they end up getting these two zones in that test tube in terms of who can grow where.